Ladies and gentlemen, we are diving now into, almost lunchtime, but before we're heading into lunch, I'd like to start with another session talking about transport and the Climate Change Global Status Report and the Tracker of Climate Strategies for Transport. We are learning now more in the upcoming 30 minutes more about the global trends in transport, demand and emissions, also showcasing policy targets and measures across global regions. And I do see her already. Lovely to see you on screen. Maruxa Cardama. Thanks for joining us. She is passionate about social, economic and environmental justice. Over the past 20 years, she's worked with leaders in government, parliament and multilateral institutions, and her focus is public policy development, capacity building and multi-stakeholder partnerships. And she's also specialized in urban and territorial development. Welcome, a warm welcome to you, to the Secretary General of the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Partnership, Maruxa Cardama. This is an introduction, right?
That was quite a mouthful, just the name, isn't it? So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And with me in the studio, and I'm very happy as always to have a live guest in the studio, Daniel Bongardt. He is currently heading the GIZ Global Transport and Climate Change Program. In a previous assignment, he coordinated GIZ's transport portfolio in China, always interested in a broad range of topics like urban mobility, freight and logistics, and of course, electromobility. Daniel Bongardt, with me in the studio. A warm welcome to you again.
Thank you, Kati. Hello, Maruxa.
Hello, Daniel. How lovely to see you both. Thanks for having me here.
Of course. And ladies and gentlemen, from our live stream, you are, as always, very welcome to post your questions in our chat. So make it a digital firework with your questions. Maruxa, before turning to your brand new report, we're having that for a moment. Tell me two things everyone should know and should remember about your organization, SLOCAT, Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. Maruxa.
Easy. Bringing a movement together. The movement that actually champions that notion of sustainable low carbon transport and tries to champion it by enabling knowledge and collective action together, and also by taking the voice of that movement into the intergovernmental processes on climate and sustainability. That's, I think, the best way to think about us, a large international multi-stakeholder partnership.
All right. I do have the cover page of the Global Status Report now with me, and I'm very curious what this report, of course, is all about. Let's celebrate the launch, Maruxa, and tell us a little bit more what makes this report also so important and happy for you and important to you.
Well, thank you so very much. I know we have a little video that will explain, in very visual terms, the nitty-gritty about the report. But to me, the most important thing is that it is the second edition. So it's really building upon the legacy of the inaugural edition, which was very much trying to put together to the benefit, not just of this SLOCAT partnership, but to the entire community of radical changes for the right type of mobility, a set of data, agglomerating the data and trying to tell the story of what that data means for decision makers, whether it is in policy, whether it is in the private sector, whether it is also in the NGO world. And the idea, therefore, is to really have a look at all the different regions in the world, have a look at different themes that go across transport, not only modes, but also themes, and focus on a series of cross-cutting elements, including behavioral change, by the way. It was a great talk that we've just heard a few minutes ago. So the report is very much at the service of the community and comes hand in hand with the call for action on data. It also allows us to see what are the data gaps in many occasions, for instance, on paratransit, on gender, on behavioral change, and how, therefore, as a community, it's very important that we come together to try to really fill those data gaps at the service of informing decision-making.
Let's have a look into your video, dear Maruxa. You brought a nice video with you, so I would say let's have a look and watch it. Thank you, Maruxa, for bringing these vibes into our studios. And of course, all these numbers, very impressive. And as everybody could see, it is a lot of work. You also brought some slides with you about the key findings and the key messages with you. Maybe we can just cut it down, for your key messages that you want to communicate, what we have to remember.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I wanted to say, I think it comes across that it's been a team effort, isn't it? That it hasn't just been a few of us, but it's really been almost the entirety of the community that has contributed in one way or another to putting together this report. And we can go to the next slide, please. And perhaps the key messages I would like to underscore here is that we know that 2019 and 20 have left an indelible mark on human and planetary history. Unfortunately, I kind of bring you good news in terms of the emissions of transport, in the sense that we are not on the right track. And we know that transport was the second highest emitting sector in 2019, and it's been the fastest growing fossil fuel combustion sector worldwide for the past decade, with emissions really going up and up and up to 17% during this period. And I can also tell you that, nevertheless, in 2020, transport recorded the biggest emission decline amongst all sectors. It was actually over 90% less than in 2019 due to the pandemic, but still, in those circumstances, we are not doing well. And still, those temporary reductions that we've seen during the pandemic is what we would need roughly on an annual basis all the way up to 2050 in order to meet the targets that we should be meeting according to the Paris Agreement on climate change. So it's all about political will. Political ambition must be increased. We are seeing that the nationally determined contributions, the plans that countries submit in the framework of the Paris Agreement to tell us about their plans for reducing emissions, are not showing sufficient ambition. Only 50% of those new nationally determined contributions that have been submitted so far have actually got specific targets on transport. And it's just a very modest improvement compared to this first generation of nationally determined contributions a few years ago. So the imperative is clear. Actually, we have seen in the pandemic how political will is essential. Political will, quick action, and the right type of investment for radical action towards the type of transport and mobility that we should be providing, and in a balanced manner, in a balance in which we are trying to avoid unnecessary motorized needs, while, of course, securing access to mobility to everyone. We should also be shifting to less intensive carbon modes, and we should be improving the transport modes. If we could move on to the last slide, I could very much want to share a few thoughts with you about the threats, the opportunities, and the uncertainties we see for climate action in transport. On threats, let me just pick up one there. Fossil fuel subsidies really continue to outspace the investment, the spending in renewable energy, and really by orders of magnitude. In terms of opportunities, I think it's very important to share the great news that there is a clear movement for setting targets to phase out internal combustion engines and therefore phase in electric vehicles. We have seen 29 countries, 11 subnational jurisdictions, and a considerable number of car manufacturers setting these type of targets. And we also have got great hope in the technology advances. We have seen how the price of batteries has really plummeted. We have seen how fuel economy standards and commitments have been introduced in the global south, and how all these together is allowing, for instance, South Asia, North America, and Europe leading the market of electric bicycles. Or we have also seen China, Chile, and Colombia really expanding their bus fleets. Another great opportunity that we have seen in the pandemic is the extent to which rather quick and not particularly costly measures can be put into place. We have seen a lot of tactical urbanism during the pandemic, how, for instance, the movement in more than 190 cities across the world to open the streets, to reclaim the streets for people's life, for cohesion, for mobility, and how this has actually shown people the opportunity of reimagining their city and seeing what it can look like when streets are not just devoted to the private car. And in terms of the uncertainties, there is, of course, a lot of questions that come up in this post-pandemic moment. Will the recovery packages yield unintended consequences? Will there be clear accountability on the type of spending that is being done to actually try to put all modes of transport on a track to decarbonization, to progressive decarbonization? Will there be enough political commitment and financing commitment towards supporting public transport systems, which are the backbone of any equitable mobility system? Or will they continue suffering from the plummeting riderships and the very dire straits financial situations in which many public transport systems across the world in many cities have found themselves. If we move now to the next slide, let me tell you a bit some of the trends we see and some of the good ideas I would like to share with you now. The next slide would be great in this moment, please. That way our participants could be watching it. So in this element of some thematic trends from A to Z, as we call them, I would like to particularly underscore a few here very quickly, because I know that then we will have a bit of time for a bit of a chat. Aviation. Despite 40% emissions increase over the past decade, there is not sufficient political attention and policy attention to aviation. Freight, again, represents 40% of global emissions, and green freight measures are not looked into enough attention as much as passenger freight is, for instance. Maritime shipping, great news here in the sense that sustainable biofuels, capacity utilization, optimizing speeds could really cut emissions down to 75%, but we need to go into that direction. Renewable energies, as I was saying, right now account for less than 4% of the energy used in the transport sector. That must change. Sustainable urban mobility plans, we are seeing the extent to which they are not just now happening in Europe, but also Latin America, for instance, is adopting a lot of sustainable urban mobility plans, but we need to put money into them. And let's not be blinded just by the idea of zero-emission vehicles. They are great, but right now they represent a small fraction of fleets at the global level, and still the sales of subs are really outweighing the emissions benefits that we are having at this very moment out of zero-emission vehicles. So if we go to the last slide, I would like to now perhaps tell you a bit some ideas of where do we go from here. Well, we got to really be serious about tackling the major threats. With the current nationally determined contribution targets that we see, we could be heading into a warming of 2.6 Celsius degrees, which is far beyond what the Paris Agreement is telling us we should be staying in if we want to guarantee a decent quality of life for all of us in this planet. We really need to expand and scale the investment opportunities. That figure of over $40 trillion needed up to 2030 remains there, and is particularly essential in emerging economies. We really got to respond to these uncertainties that we've got there. And we know that, the money is being deployed. So it's about deploying it to the right actions. And last but not least, the transport community needs to continue being strengthened. It's about really showing all together and bringing others along to see that low carbon transport is the most effective area for reducing emissions, even more effective than shifts in food or shifts in housing or on other sectors. So let's continue curating this community of change makers and mix this community of transport change makers with other communities in the sustainability, in the urban sustainability arena, in the renewables arena, in the health arena, and so on and so forth. All that to say that we need many more editions of a week like this one to make sure that that community can keep growing. Back to you in the studio, please.
Thank you, Maruxa. Thank you so much. A question, talking with all your passion and with the key findings now, what is the key finding that made you particularly happy about it?
Well, I have to say that it's a difficult question, because a lot of things made me happy, but I also have to say that a lot of things concern me. So let me try to stay positive, nevertheless. But I had to use that disclaimer because it's important to stay optimistic with realism, I think. But the most important thing to me was to see that only with a fraction of the money that has been so far deployed through recovery packages for the pandemic, we could really get to the level of investment we need to really change the paradigm of sustainable low carbon transport. So when we think that money is an issue, when we find that it's going to be very difficult, to mobilize that money, the good news in this story is that it's not just the money mobilization itself, but it's redirecting towards the right type of investment. And another connection, if you want, with that, and connected to the session that we've just heard before this one, is behavioral change, really the appetite in citizens, in all of us, to see a different way of moving around in our cities, to really use our streets for a bit more of social cohesion. I think that those two combined, the money is being deployed, and the realization that we've all gone through, bring me a lot of hope, even if the circumstances, as I have to say, force us to be realistic optimists and very stubborn optimists, as Christiana Figueres would say, because it's really time for radical action, and that's what we got to bear in mind.
Thank you, Maruxa. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, in case you have any further questions, please post them in the chat. Maruxa will be available, of course, until the end of the session. Now heading over to Daniel. Daniel, when we talk about the tracker of climate strategies for transport, what is the context, and of course, what are the objectives of this new tracker that got launched today?
Yes, thank you. So the tracker of climate strategies for transport is a database, basically, that is online and constantly filled up with more information. And Maruxa just has mentioned the importance of the NDC, and in the run-up to the next climate conference in Glasgow this year, more and more countries now submitting new climate plans, so-called NDCs, and so we need to see what is in them about transport. So colleagues have sit together and compiled the first climate plans that were submitted in 2015, about 170 at that stage, and now already have put together 60 new ones and updated NDCs, and also included the long-term strategies that countries are now submitting towards the year 2050. So we have another 29 now in, and the database is online, and the data is available at your hand all the time. It's not in a report because it's constantly changing. And when we look at the database, I brought a small video, a screen recording that is shown now, I guess. And when we look at that database, we see there's a world map coming up on the front page, and you can see all the different countries, and you see basically the targets they have set for the transport sector. So you can browse over it, and then you can click on any country and see kind of a country fact sheet that summarizes all the information. And if we look at this, we see that all the quotes from the original documents are taken and put into the database. So you can click on this and even access the original sources here. You can also look not only at the targets, but at the mitigation actions and some further information about processes and other areas around the transport sector. So you have that sector information at your hand. You can, of course, filter all the different ideas. And for example, here, Latin America, information about Latin America is then compiled, and you easily find peers or other countries and what they are doing, and can look at their documents. So most important is maybe this section on mitigation and adaptation measures or climate actions, where we have put together quite a lot of indicators. I think it's more than 150, and we can filter and browse around the different indicators, such, for example, what's in there on electric mobility, what is in there on cycling and other things we heard this morning in the panel discussion. What have the countries committed to and want to do until 2030? So in that respect, when we look at this tracker, I think one of the important areas is that we need to think about who is the target group of this. And I guess now the video stopped somehow. Anyhow, we do not need to look at it. I think you had a first glimpse and insight into that discussion. Why we have put it together. I think the important target group here is our partners in our partner countries. And the partner countries, they are really interested in what's going on in other countries, what have other countries put in the NDCs, and see what they are doing. So I think here's really the added value of this, especially in times of COVID. We do not have a possibility to travel, but we can access information from the other countries.
Thank you for your insights, Daniel. A question also, of course, when we talk about the tracker, what is the main finding that really surprised you when going into the work, when now, publishing this tremendous work over months and years of gathering information and, of course, of bringing people together. So what stands out for you? What is the main finding?
So one of the important information is that we'll have quite a lot of transport in the NDCs. The transport sector is really represented there. And when we now look at the new round of NDCs, more and more electric mobility is coming up. So that's, I think, very obvious even from the first 60 ones, that almost all the countries in the global north and in the global south, they have included electric mobility in their climate plans.
And what does it mean again for looking ahead to Glasgow, to the next upcoming COP? So what does this tracker mean? When we look ahead, what should be done? What should be discussed? What is the focus on that you want to see put on the COP?
Mm-hmm. I think Maruxa already has mentioned it. The transport community really needs to act, and we need the COP and the climate negotiators as well to see that the transport sector at the moment is not tackled yet. We have still rising emissions. More and more people travel further distances. And in the end, we really need to define a clear mitigation and decarbonization pathway until mid-century. And it will be a huge challenge to do so. And one aspect I think the negotiators need to be aware is that international aviation and international maritime transport are sectors that are not included in the NDCs in the long-term strategies of the countries, but it's international negotiations by ICAO and IMO. And here more needs to be done, because otherwise we will not reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Maruxa. I'd like to come in with you now into that question. Of course, when we look ahead into the COP in Glasgow, so again, what is your to-do that you see? What is your priority? I mean, the transport family and the transport community needs to be heard, but nevertheless, Daniel was just mentioning, of course, action is also needed. So how do we put ourselves into that mode of action and not just of discussing to-dos?
Well, I think there is great opportunity in the COP26 that is coming up, amongst other things, because the presidency of COP26, the United Kingdom, has chosen the electric mobility, the phasing out of internal combustion engines as a topic for priority. And that is phenomenal. It also allows us to tell the story that electrification is no silver bullet, that it really needs to be part of a wider sustainable low carbon transport strategy, and that we really need to focus attention on that balanced approach to avoiding, shifting and improving. We've seen cycling exploding during the pandemic. We know that 70% of almost all trips include a part of walking, and we know that public transport is at risk. So it's an opportunity to really use the movement towards phasing out internal combustion engines at the service of intermobility and at the service of looking and prioritizing a notion of transport that is based on accessibility to everyone. I think that another important aspect that we can hook ourselves to is the importance that the UK presidency of COP26 is given to financing. How actually is impossible to talk climate action without landing it in the idea of financing. So I would really love to see a discussion in which we are really putting the focus on those recovery packages for pandemic and see how they can actually help us to put, as I was saying, all transport modes on a track to proper, sound, and also just decarbonization over the next decade or so. I would love to see in that COP substantive discussions and substantive progress around aviation and around maritime, and equally substantive and proportional attention being paid to freight measures. It would be great if we could imagine that a big part of what right now is being moved around by car, on the road, by truck, could be moved with a connection between road and rail, both of them electrified potentially, or actually moving part of that road freight, for instance, to inland waterways. That I think would be phenomenal. And a third aspect that I think we need to take as a community to COP is really this important about data, how certain prevailing data gaps around what is called paratransit or informal transport services, which in many countries, in many cities in the global south, are hardly the only sort of public transport means that people can access if they don't own a car. How the importance on data about that is essential how data on gender-sensitive planning is also critical, is also absolutely crucial, and how, for instance, certain modes like walking do receive a bit less of attention when we are looking into data crunching and data gathering, and how all these gaps, for instance, these three that I've already mentioned, sort of constitute a bias then towards what decision makers and policy makers can actually do with public policy, isn't it? So for me, those three elements, internal combustion engine as an entry point for us to really push into that direction, absolutely, of electrification in a wider notion of sustainable low carbon transport mobility, attention to finance, the money that is critically needed, attention to freight, to aviation, maritime, and data, the data that is needed to inform decision makers.
Underlining the data. Thank you so much. And I have a suggestion. We have a talk after the COP26, again at the Transport and Climate Change Week, to discuss what have been done. I have a question for you from the chat, anonymously into the chat, posted into the chat, but the question is really relevant when we look into the report. Which country or world region has the best performance for sustainable transport according to status report? Maruxa.
Well, I mean, there is a combination of factors that make Europe quite a place in that sense. And I would like to see it. Unfortunately, it's an European who is saying it. So I really hope that I will not come across as personally biased. It's really database, and I would invite you to certainly visit the website tcc-gsr.com, and you can actually see all the data broken down by regions of the world. But what are the factors there? I think that we cannot neglect the importance of something called the European Union and the legislation that emanates from the European Union, the regulation and how it is transposed to different countries. This speaks about the importance of having clear targets that move the market, that send a signal to the private sector, and that actually allow that normative framework to keep on moving. The normative framework doesn't come only from the European Union as such, also comes from, for instance, all the movement to setting up low emission zones that we have seen in different cities in Europe. And of course, what happens and what works a lot as well is quite a tradition, isn't it, of civic movements and of a governance that mixes the national level and the subnational level. Europe has got that opportunity of seeing countries and their cities and their regions working together. An example in Germany, examples in Spain, examples, in many countries around Europe. That actually places it in a very good position. But I would really invite our audience to have a look and see the great ideas that are flourishing in other areas, in other regions of the world. As I was saying, Latin America right now and the Caribbean is the hub for actually the expansion of sustainable urban mobility plans, which are a phenomenal framework where an entire urban community and obviously government level, but also civil society come together and set the framework of how they want their mobility to look like in their city. And the number of sustainable urban mobility plans that we have seen emerging in Latin America and Caribbean over the past 2 years, it's phenomenal, to the point that very soon it won't be Europe dominating, let's say, the largest amount of sustainable urban mobility plans that exist. So I think that there is hope across all regions. Even in North America, there is a lot of hope right now with the changes in the recent administration in the United States and how they are really coming to the forefront at the international arena and also working towards electrification. So let's not play one region against the other. Let's, I think, look more at what are the elements that are working in each region and see to what extent they can be scaled up and adapted, of course, adapted to the real specific context of every region and every country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In one sentence, why is it so crucial to read your report as the last bits and pieces from this session?
Well, a one-stop shop for data, for developments, for what is working and is not working, and to tell you where do we urgently need to go and how we can actually make it happen. It's possible, it's desirable, and it's feasible.
Absolutely. Maruxa Cardama, thank you so much for joining us. Daniel Bongardt, the same question to you. Why is it so crucial now to read the report?
I think it's essential to have information and to base decisions on data and on information. And SLOCAT's efforts are great to compile this all over the world.
Thank you so much, Daniel Bongardt. And this is the report to read, ladies and gentlemen. You will find it online, download it, and have a look into it. And of course, have a debate and discussion about it. Thank you so much to both of you, Maruxa Cardama and Daniel Bongardt.